Today we're going to discuss aligning ERM to the company. This is the 49th episode in the Crossing Thin Ice podcast series brought to you by Actuarial Risk Management. My name is Max Rudolph, and as always, I'm joined by Dave Ingram. Creating an ERM program should not be standardized. There's not a single best approach. It should reflect what your company values and be internally consistent with the business and risk culture that is present. Dave has some real insights that make it easier to see the alternatives. Our aim is for the Crossing Thin Ice podcast series to help with your ERM program and risk knowledge. We hope you are already taking advantage of our quarterly newsletter and webcast and encourage you to share with board members, C-suite leaders, peers, and students. Anyone interested in continuous learning and risk management. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We are here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds.
I used to think that there was one best way to do ERM, and that when insurers adopted that approach, it would end up transforming the way that they did their business. That was 25 years ago, and the experiences that I have had since then, hearing most of the world's largest insurers describe their ERM programs, definitely moved me off of that opinion. Those large company ERM programs were significantly different from one another, and at those companies where the ERM program had any success, that was when I saw that the ERM program fit very carefully with their business, rather than transforming the business to fit the ERM program. Over the succeeding decades, I worked with well over 100 different smaller insurers on their ERM programs and saw over and over the situation where a company tried to adopt the best approach to ERM only to have the company reject that system sooner or later. This so-called best practices approach just doesn't fit almost any company. It was too tight in some places and too loose in others. There were several common areas where there was a poor fit. They're not wrong in general, but they do end up being wrong in particular at some companies. First, there's the idea of aggregate risk tolerance. This is considered by many to be absolutely essential to true enterprise risk management. But high surplus mutual insurers in the U.S. will generally not be interested at all in considering this concept. They just don't see themselves ever having to worry about how much capital that they have. And besides, it's often a source of pride to them that they are so highly overcapitalized. Next, there's the idea of individual risk limits. Some of the same companies will be reluctant to have limits for individual risks. They fear that the limit will be seen by their employees as an allowance to take that much risk. That limit will encourage more risk-taking, they believe. There's a solution to both of these situations. The aggregate risk tolerance and the individual risk limits can both be replaced by plan values. Then risk both in total and for individual situations can be managed mostly like everything else, with a target. In both cases, management can also treat those plan targets as checkpoints, a place where, when they're met, when you hit those, management can pause and decide what to do next. Another company might object to the formal governance structure of ERM. ERM is seen as creating a lot of needless bureaucracy by those companies, adding costly overhead to an otherwise lean operation. While working with one such insurer, I thought I was going to literally get tarred and feathered when I suggested they needed to write down their risk management processes in a risk management framework document, no matter how brief it would be. They just did not want to be constrained by what was written on a piece of paper. In the end, all we ended up creating for their ERM program was a quarterly report that showed their risk positions compared to plans that they showed to the rating agency. I was never sure that they ever even looked at those documents themselves. Emerging risk management is a troubling concept for some companies, and it often turns out the people who are best at operating a risk management program that is focused on measurement and risk limit enforcement are just not the kind of person who's needed to imagine the risks that never happened before that might cause future harm. One such company had decided in 2018 that developing a work-from-home plan was just not feasible or necessary. They were faced with creating a work from home plan from scratch when most employees were out of the office and under COVID quarantine. That included buying laptops for all their customer service staff, installing needed software, and paying for them to be delivered to everyone's home, and then training folks to adopt mostly new protocols remotely as their staff was learning what the word Zoom meant. My favorite objectors to ERM are those business unit heads who are caught blindsided when a newly developed capital model shows that their business has the worst risk-adjusted returns of any of the company's activities. It then becomes that business unit head's purpose in life to undermine the credibility of the capital model. This makes for a great burden of extra work to defend the model and often results in the model project being rejected because senior management is just not sure what to believe. Before they had that model, the results that they looked at for that product line showed it to be very successful. On the other hand, a company that puts great value on data and careful analysis will not be happy with their ERM program until it is tied to a state-of-the-art model. That same company may also be reluctant to take risks seriously, though, to take risks seriously that are difficult to quantitatively model, such as operational risks or regulatory change. A company that highly values innovation will want to use their emerging risk analysis to both identify risks and to help them find new opportunities. A company that values well-managed processes will find a formal ERM governance process to their liking. They will see that it provides up-to-date information on how well their businesses are holding to the ERM program standards and that their risk exposures are in the range that they plan for. This would allow them to react to deviations in a timely manner and avoid any end-of-year surprises. Let's talk about 4 steps to finding a good-fitting ERM program. I follow these steps to better tailor an ERM program to a company. First, we clarify their main objective for ERM. Is it a focus on capital adequacy, on managing year-by-year losses, improving returns for risk taken, or satisfying regulatory and rating agency requirements? Second, we talk about their risk culture and examine their underlying risk culture beliefs. Third, they should build off their existing risk management strengths. All insurers have significant risk management strengths. That's a fact, not survivor bias. And finally, I try to install the expectation that they will need to support an iterative process for developing a good ERM program, which changes every year to trim away or fix what is not working and to strengthen what is. By aligning ERM to a company's unique needs and traits, you can create a risk management program that is embraced by the business unit management, that influences strategic decision-making, and that helps the organization navigate an increasingly complex risk landscape. The key is tailoring, not trying to force a generic best practice approach. With the right customized ERM program, you can substantially improve the company's ERM practices and ultimately their resilience. Risk management for insurers is now more complex than ever, and staying ahead requires more than traditional approaches. That's where AI comes in. Our artificial intelligence-assisted risk management solutions provide a powerful edge by delivering insights that are faster, deeper, and more actionable. From stress testing and scenario planning to risk environment scanning, staff training, and risk culture enhancement, our tools are made to be tailored to meet your specific needs. With AI, you can anticipate emerging risk, refine your strategies, and make decisions with confidence, even in uncertain environments. Let us help you turn complexity into clarity and risk into opportunity. Take your risk management to the next level with AI.
Dave, let's get started by talking about how ERM can be aligned and made specific to a company. For example, do you approach situations where a company's culture resists the changes necessary for an effective ERM program?
Oh, thanks, Max. That's a great question because it happens all the time. If a company has been operating without an ERM program, often an ERM program seems like punishment to some folks. And that winds up being somewhat of a cultural reaction in a company. I've got a whole list of things that I do in those situations. The first thing I do is take a step back and say, have I missed this? Because if I've been working with a company, I'm trying to suggest to them an ERM program that does fit with their culture. So one of the things that I often do when that comes up is I try and learn more about the company culture so that I can help advise, help them to find a fit here. But I also remind them of the motivations for doing this. Often the motivations are the rating agency attention to risk management. There certainly have been years, and I'm willing to bet 2025 is going to be one of those years when the rating agency comes out of the box saying risk management is going to be one of our top topics for the year. The other thing I might do is go back to the person who was the executive champion for the ERM program. Usually there's one person, most often it's the chief actuary or the CFO brought me in the first place to talk to them about ERM and have a conversation with them about the culture misfit there. Usually I'll advise they think about making smaller, more incremental developments if they're not willing to kind of bite the bullet and dive into the pool, like maybe go one step into the shallow end. Worst comes to worst, you wind up having to, in some cases, take the question to the top, go to the CEO, go to the board member that was insisting that you do this ERM program and mention to them it's not working out here. Usually, what that's going to mean is that there's going to be have to be a lot more messaging from the top. A lot more statements about how this is important, a lot more questions of people about, well, what is your ERM process? Tell us about this.
Yeah, I think you're right about 2025 being an important year for risk. How can companies balance compliance for these external stakeholders like regulators or rating agencies against an internal ERM program?
I did ERM work for at least 10 years before I finally figured out the question that I could ask at the beginning of a consultation process. And that question wound up being asking people, well, were they interested in doing this for the external stakeholders, the rating agencies, the regulators? Were they interested in doing it to manage their own risks, or were they interested in doing it to manage their capital? And certainly I got all different answers to that question, but that one almost always started a conversation about risk management, which I was not particularly effective at doing before I stumbled on that question. And the answers I got was that probably, as I said before, maybe half the companies I ever worked with said they really were doing this ERM stuff to make the rating agencies and the regulators happy. They didn't have any internal motivation for that. So for those companies, it's not a balancing act. It's a chop it. We're going to do just what they ask, and that's it. A lot of other companies were saying, well, we want to make the regulators and rating agencies happy, but we also want it to be useful to us. We don't want to be wasting our own time doing something that is only for regulatory compliance or whatever. In those cases, depending on their budget, sometimes the process would be, well, let's take an over look and see what's the overlap between the things that are important to you, the management team, and the things that are important to these outside agencies, and focus on the ones that fall on both lists first. Those are the really high motivation activities. And in other cases, it's like, okay, well, let's go for the list that is only the required list first, but then put on the ones that you like as the second wave of things. So, Mac, let me ask you a question about this. How important do you think it is to include folks that are outside the ERM team when you're trying to figure out how to fit the ERM program to the company?
Thanks, Dave. I think that all of us are biased in many ways. A life insurer and property insurer will will likely view ERM very differently. A multi-line company needs to work through this to have a consistent definition that everybody can use to aggregate risks, and everyone needs to transparently communicate their process in order for it to work. We get used to thinking in certain ways. A great way to improve is to regularly interact with others from outside the team, whether this is external environmental scanning to pick up on emerging risks, or engaging someone in the organization who thinks with foresight over a longer time horizon. These types of interactions provide new ideas that can be rejected, viewed qualitatively, or integrated into the quantitative process. By reviewing the ERM process of other experts, this can give you options and flexibility. It's all part of being a lifetime learner. So Dave, how should ERM priorities differ between startups and organizations of different size?
Well, Max, the size thing, that's really big. What struck me, one of the first ERM consulting assignments I did was with a really small company, a company with less than 50 employees. What I noticed when I was doing the conversations that I had with the management team to get that started was that it was clear that the management team pretty much saw everybody in the company every day. And so the idea in that company was that any information they wanted employees to get was pretty easy to get out to everybody, and so communication wasn't a big barrier. You think about a large company with multiple floors, multiple locations in different cities, maybe even on different continents. Communication is a huge issue. So there's a huge part of ERM for a large organization that has to do with trying to communicate your risk positions, communicate your risk policies, and react to information that's coming across those different lines of communication. So that's a huge thing in terms of the priorities and the structures of the ERM program. Interestingly, I just mentioned really tiny, really huge. The mid-sized companies, as usual, are squeezed in that process. They're trying to keep up with the large companies who can dedicate a significant size staff to the ERM function by assigning the work to people that already have full-time jobs. So there's a lot of triage going on in the mid-sized companies. Interestingly, with startups, most often they don't prioritize thinking about risk and risk management because there's a lot of reasons a startup could fail. And most of them aren't the things that we're focused on in a risk management program. They're mainly focused on succeeding in their initial business premise. But I've seen a few startups that did focus on ERM from the start. And those companies, by the time they matured into a successful company with an ongoing business of significant size, they had a fantastic risk management program because it was really in the DNA of the company. That nobody thought of doing anything without considering the risk. Nobody thought of doing anything without doing the appropriate risk mitigation activities that they did. And everybody was really interested in finding out whether or not the company was keeping up with its risk tolerance or not.
So Dave, a lot of times I'll say, ERM is a process, not a project. It requires evolution over time. So once an initial program is in place, what are some things that companies can decide they want for the second wave or a later wave of their ERM program development?
Let me just go back because I don't think I clearly said what's in that first wave. What I think should be in the first wave is a combination of documenting the existing risk management practices because almost all insurance companies have some pretty decent existing risk management practices, even if they don't have an ERM program, and then bringing the places where they have holes in that process up to the standard that they have around the company. So it really has to do with managing, putting in place the control processes consistently for all of their risks, setting it up so that there is a process for setting limits on those risks and that those limits are known and become part of the actual ongoing business practices. And that's what I think the first wave should focus on is getting that all in order. And once that's in order, the kind of things that I would suggest on the second wave, things like stress testing. That's a relatively low budget risk measurement system, and I don't think one of these webcasts has gone by, Max, that we haven't mentioned stress testing. So here we go again. But the other two things that I think should be high on the list for that second wave is the risk culture. We mentioned that just a few minutes ago, identifying what the existing risk culture is and then figuring out if that's what you want it to be and how can you adapt it to being closer to what you want it to be is a project for that second wave. And then bringing the board in. I tell folks if the board wasn't the initiator in the risk management project, wait till the second year to get them involved. So the board should be involved by that second year at the very latest, though, so that the communications, the reporting that you've developed, you have to develop a version of that goes to the board. Sometimes it's the exact same version that management's using, but often you probably want to put a little less detail in what you're giving to the board. So those are the three areas that I would suggest for the second year. That's stress testing, risk culture, and governance. A fourth thing that you may or may not put on there is setting your company's overall risk tolerance and risk appetite. And I think that depends on how quickly you adopt the stress testing and how you work with that, or if you have a strong linkage in your company thinking to either the rating agency capital formulas or the RBC.
An ERM program is an evolution, with company goals looking for everything from low-hanging fruit to a formal governance process to a full capital model. Right-sizing ERM based on exposures accepted allows companies of different size to personalize their response and communication efforts. As Dave said, why are you doing this is the most important question to answer. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice, presented by Actuarial Risk Management. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.